Hello, my name is Shelby McKinley, and today I will be discussing the serial killer William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer. So to start off, let's talk about some of his history. William Bonin was born in Willimantic, Connecticut, and like many other serial killers, he was born in quite the dysfunctional family. He was the middle child, and his father was an alcoholic. His mother was also an alcoholic. And so he was typically left with his grandfather, who is actually a child molester. And so when the children would be left at home with the grandfather, Bonin was typically assaulted by his grandfather. But the trust was there since all of since his mom and dad were both gone and just left to be watched. So he was not only sexually assaulted by his grandfather throughout his upbringing, but he actually had to go to the juvenile delinquency center after stealing license plates off cars. And while he was in there, he actually was used as basically for sex among all of the other older boys and was sexually molested throughout his time at the delinquency center. After he was released from that center, he returned home and would sexually assault his siblings and neighborhood children. So he has grown up now and he joins the United States Air Force. He actually served about 700 hours before being honorably discharged, but it wasn't until after that they realized that he actually sexually assaulted two officers that were under him. After being discharged, he ended up actually getting married for a short period of time, but that did not last long. As you could see, he did get divorced and ended up moving to California, where the beginning of the Freeway Killer really began, not in Connecticut. So his first few crimes was he was first arrested in 1969 because he was sexually assaulted young boys and was charged with 5 counts of kidnapping and 4 counts of sexual assault. He was then released in 1974 and then ended up raping an adolescent boy hitchhiker about 6 months after he was released. And then in 1979, he was arrested for molesting another adolescent boy while on probation, but there was an administration error, so he was not sent back to jail. And this was ultimately where the freeway killer began, because if you'll notice this quote at the bottom, this was actually from a buddy who picked Bonin up from the police station after this arrest in 1979, and he said, "No one's going to testify again. This is never going to happen to me again." You can tell that this is kind of where it all began, because he was tired of being arrested for just something he was doing and that he did not see that he needed to keep getting in trouble for. He actually had 4 accomplices. Only 3 are pictured here because one of them does not have any pictures online. But Vernon Butts, the first one, was an active murderer in a lot of the killings. And then James Monroe was a coworker of Bonin, and Gregory Matthews was an acquaintance. The 4th one was William Pugh, who was actually the reason Bonin was arrested later on, but we'll get to that more later. And all of these gentlemen were arrested in 1980 when everyone was arrested after a decade of killings. And there wasn't really a team killing concept here. Bonin was ultimately the boss, but these 4 gentlemen were actively participating in either the kidnapping, the raping, or the killing, or they were just watching and not doing anything. But they were active participants throughout many of the murders. So these are the majority of the victims' names. Bonin was actually charged with 14 official murders, but he's suspected of about 20 to 30 murders total of adolescent boys. So I'm not going to go through all of these because a majority of them were killed either by strangulation or they were beaten. But some of the notable ones, the first one was Thomas Lundgren at 14. He was emasculated and strangled in the back of this van. This was the iconic van that Bonin and his team drove around. Another notable kid that was murdered by Bonin, or victim, was Marcus Grubbs, who was stabbed 77 times. There was not much literature on why 77 times was the number for this, but I thought that was a very outlandish number. And then his youngest was James McCabe, who was 12, and he was at a rest stop, and he was outside, and Bonin picked him up, and James was actually going to Disney World when he was kidnapped. He was then kidnapped, raped, and strangled, and then Bonin crushed his neck with a jackknife. So he had a very brutal murder. And then another notable victim was Darren Lee Kendrick. He was not only raped and strangled, but he was also forced to drink chloral hydrate, which can give you chemical burns. So after it had been ingested in his autopsy, it had burned through a lot of his intestines and his body, and it looked like a very gruesome death. So male serial killers, typically you'll find them picking up strangers. They're going to stay local. They're going to have kind of a control power motive, and they tend to pick up and or kidnap women. And they also mostly hold blue-collar jobs. With Bonin, he picks up strangers. Yes, he picks up hitchhikers, or his acquaintances will talk the boys into the van. Sometimes they would offer rides, or they would offer money in exchange for sex, but none of the victims knew what they were getting into when they stepped into that van. So his victim type was adolescent boys. He typically stayed within the Orange County area. We talked about his childhood trauma, which is, again, a key component to serial killers. And he was also a truck driver and held this job throughout for about a decade, around the time he was actively killing these boys. So the main typologies that I found was based off the Massachusetts Treatment Center typology, which would be the displaced aggression rapist typology, because of just the aggressive nature of his killings, because he was sodomizing, he was stabbing, strangling, he was bonding up his victims, and would typically throw them out onto the freeway. He dumped some behind in dumpsters or just in alleys. Some people were never found, or some victims were never found. So he really does fit that displaced aggression. Another typology would be the power control oriented. Because of his growing up, his upbringing, you can kind of tell that he really didn't have the control of his life. He was always being used by someone else, and he never really had that control over his own life. So after he was free to make his own choices, he took that control into his own hands and became very power hungry and was looking for that sexual control, because he was introduced to sex at a very young age in a very inappropriate manner. So it is not surprising that leaving this untreated and never really getting any sort of treatment for this did spiral and manifest into the serial killer he became. So what happened to William Bonin? Well, back to William Pugh, he was arrested for auto theft in 1980s. And when he was picked up, he told detectives about everything Bonin had been doing, which then put detectives on Bonin's trail. And they actually caught Bonin in the act of raping a 15-year-old boy that he had picked up off the street. He was officially arrested in June 11th, 1980. He was convicted of 14 out of 21 murders and was sentenced to death. His last meal was 2 pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 3 6-packs of Coke. He also got to hang out with friends while waiting. He was later that night killed by lethal injection in the state of California, and he was actually the first person to be killed by lethal injection in the state of California. So, William Bonin was not your stereotypical male serial killer. He did stand out from them, being a homosexual serial killer, focusing mainly on hitchhiking adolescent boys and looking for that sexual control. So it is important that we study serial killers who don't fit the norm, because we're always needing to update that literature so that way we have an accurate description of who we may be looking for. Thank you for listening, and this is my works cited.